One of the things I seem to think about repeatedly is the meaning of my own history and everybody else's. And the question that the people asked John the Baptist after he had warned them to flee from the wrath to come, what shall we do then? And what he told them, in essence, was don't screw people over, and then went on to proclaim the coming of a future condition in which something less elementary than this advice might be possible. Well, I've always thought that one of the most horrifying old sayings of our culture is all's fair in love and war. Love and war are precisely the two activities that ought to be hedged about with rules for right behavior because people can be hurt. Far better to acknowledge and codify human weakness in places where the only hurt is economic. Saying ought to be all's fair in commodity trading and the secondary art market. What I wanted to talk about on this first stop of the Love and War tour, second appearance, as most of you know, in Atlanta on Friday night, is one's teachers, who are not necessarily one's elders, and who appear throughout one's life in a succession of meetings with remarkable men and women. I realized recently that a lot of my poems deal with teachers of one sort or another, so I think I'm going to arrange tonight's reading to deal with half a dozen cases of teachers, explicit or implicit, and end with the only poem in which a teacher does not appear. I realized just this morning, in fact, that life really is like graduate school. The days are as electrifying and as boring by turns as a long succession of seminar sessions in which we learn or more often walk away bewildered. The only difference is that you don't always know what the assignment is until you realize that you haven't turned it in. But my poems are what they are, mostly because of a writer I encountered when I was 22 and 23. I'd come to California in love with the mystico-erotic traditions of the West, as we used to call Europe, on the one hand, and through Ezra Pound, the poems of China and Japan on the other. Kenneth Rexroth combined all of this with an intense ethical undercurrent and a sizable dose of humor, and basically I was hooked. His readings were more like performances in dramatic settings, and again, I'm afraid I was hooked for life. The poems I'm going to read tonight pick up on several other influences that were required later on and follow my own path, but I ultimately agree with Rexroth's observation that most poets write only one long poem, and that one is an interior monologue. Actually, I had also arrived in California totally fascinated by the poems of Brother Antoninus, which I had encountered my senior year of college. And Brother Antoninus was another poet whose readings were systematic performances. I saw him once in his role as Dominican monk, and once a year later when he was William Everson again, having torn off his robe in a performance I did not see, and announced his intention to leave the Dominican order and marry. I now realize that my admiration for performance artists like Spalding Gray comes from those early viewings of Brother Antoninus or Everson, dragging us along on a biographical trip of which not even he knew the destination. That was another thing about Rexroth. Not all of my existential heroes of the time knew each other, but they all were friends of Kenneth Rexroth, and at least half of them performed in Santa Barbara because he wanted them to visit. Actually, even the poets he didn't bring to California. My other favorite from my senior year was the English poet Denise Levertov, who was the American who discovered her writing and put her first in an American anthology. Right, yeah. Actually, Theodore Roethke was another big favorite who lived on the West Coast and didn't know Rexroth, but he was already dead. Poems of China and Japan fascinated me because they were full of sensuous detail that turned out to be completely conventional symbolism. Clouds and rain signified sexual passion. Banana leaves signified something, don't remember what. Geese together signified marital bliss, but the lone goose flying signified, symbolism doesn't exactly stick with you. What Rexroth did with all of this was to find equivalents that didn't require a whole battery of footnotes, although footnotes were useful, God knows. Wild geese evoke an emotional reaction, whether you know what Libo and Dufu made of them or not. Rexroth sometimes drops in references such as, if the full moon signifies the enlightened bliss of Amida, what is the half moon? The half moon is the embrace of Shaka and Tara. Nice to know who Amida Buddha is, even nicer to know about the mystical significance of the male and female couples of Tantric Buddhism, but the lines stick in the memory all by themselves. So as we sit here amid the falling flowers of spring, supposedly under the light of a waning half moon, but I don't see, but that may, as is the way of spring, be threatened by clouds and rain. I've tried to weave together a line of thought about love and war and the way beyond both, a blend of Freud, Christ, and Buddha that may not always make sense any more than a life makes sense. We will not reach the end of anything, but I hope that you will find some interesting things along the road. There are many journeys in these poems, but in these poems there is only one road. And this is a London elegy for Kenneth Rexroth. Clouds and a cold June rain, the city of London lives up to the world's expectations for English weather. It is the Russian Church's Pentecost. The Western calendar has ended the great feasts of the suffering and living body. The Royal Marines are advancing on West Falkland or slowly encircling Port Stanley. Wartime reporting tends to get its true stories garbled. Kenneth Rexroth is dead in Santa Barbara. Mr. Rexroth, the Times announces, is remembered chiefly as a translator of Chinese verse. Another story garbled by time and distance. On Oxford Street, the old autobiographical novel sells for £1 remaindered. Just a little American local color spun from an age when anarchists knew Latin and literary renaissances sprang up in Chicago. Rain erects the trade of Regent Street's temples of style and commerce. The museum of mankind is equally empty, and I study pictures of Isfahan's architecture. Persian dreams of order bloomed into petaled geometry. Bedford Square embodies the thicker visions of 18th century empire. Merchants ruthless for queen and country lined their own pockets and endowed foundations. Colonial conquerors slogged through Tibet and India and came home carrying Hindu and Buddhist scriptures. Guards at the British Museum search parcels in raincoats. The provisionals are backing Argentina with bomb threats. In the Egyptian room, the late Greek mummy portraits wear the pain and fragility of an uncertain epoch, and their young, blank faces painted in wax on wood. In the Asian gallery, Gandhara bodhisattvas wear looks of infinitely weary compassion, like the tired pub keepers of Pembridge Road setting it up for the boys in the back room. In a hallway of display cases, clay Aphrodites kneel or stand rising from open shelves in gestures fixed once for sale by the temple vendors. And here, once, one of Russia's visionaries saw holy wisdom in a woman's profile, and Marx, less imaginative, wrote his longest theoretical contribution. RG jets hit ships is the outdated bannerhead on the rain-soaked picture paper lying in Gower Street. High wind riffles the wet, coarse pages past last week's petty scandals and last week's photo of one more bare-breasted British 19-year-old. Summed up so many times, so monotonously. Checkmated, Hakim, on the chessboard of our passions, and Buddha, greed, ignorance, and delusion. Now that British Telecom has computerized history, war turns to lines of flickering angular text on a constantly updated video display terminal. The slower news from BBC Two television shows Israeli gunners flattening Lebanon. The Royal Marines really are moving on Stanley, life in the 80s being too simultaneous to permit the luxury of one conflict per evening. Last blossoms of a late cold spring shatter in gusts of wind. Here, as in the old poems, the cuckoo's song between the bursts of rain cries, perishing, perishing, and the petals fall, and summer's green dullness summons in Trinity season. I write a lot of elegies. About half of them seem to be set in autumn or winter and the other half in springtime. This is because I usually can't think in the summer, even though I used to be able to. Plus, a lot of them are travel poems, and I can only afford to travel in the off-season and during wartime. I almost bought the $198 special to London a few weeks ago, but I had no time and no reason to be there. I write elegies that are a traditional way to be reflective in verse, because I honor my earliest teachers. And unfortunately, teachers are mortal, and I encountered most of them late in their lives. Mircea Eliade was one such teacher. I was fascinated with his past biography in Europe before he became a historian of religions. I was fascinated with the fact that he wrote mythically oriented novels. And fortunately, his other students were even more fascinated, so some of them translated his journals and fiction from French or Romanian, and I got to read about him long after I studied with him briefly when I was 22. I decided ultimately that I liked his fiction and his life story a whole lot more than his scholarship. However, I decided long ago that the only way to honor someone is to be as entertaining as possible. So I frequently lead off readings with letters from the Eros Hotel because, well, you'll see in a minute. But I should probably explain that the Eros Hotel was a real place, named after the little statue of Cupid that sits in the middle of Piccadilly Circus in London. AIDS Awareness Week in London in 1987 was mostly devoted to the idea that AIDS was very much an omnisexual disease. The program featured a little teaching story, sort of like Arthur Schnitzler's play Le Ronde, with a round, the circle, in which a London businessman named George, who is bisexual, flies to New York, where he has sex with an infected gay male named Eric. George then returns to London, where he has sex with his secretary Margaret, who has sex with her boyfriend Thomas, who meets Belinda at a club. And at the end of the story, half the population of the British Isles has AIDS. I really was watching this program while trying to figure out from the map just where the newly opened Freud Museum was located. I really was still reeling from the recent death of my existential hero, Eliade. So this is Letters from the Eros Hotel, 7 fragments in memory of Mircea Eliade. 1. 10 p.m. Bottles shatter on pavement outside this London window. Watching an improbably graphic ITV special for AIDS Awareness Week here in a hotel 200 yards from Piccadilly Circus, I write postcards, plan my visit to the Freud Museum with ambiguous London maps, think about Oscar Miłosz and eat dinner from the nearby Hindustani takeout. McDonald's is located next door to the hotel. Earnest young men and women on ITV talk about issues of love and death, civilization and its discontents as viewed from the Eros Hotel, 1987. 2. In 1940, Royal Romania, foreseeing fascist apocalypse, sent its less political intellectuals off to be diplomats and cultural attachés. Mircea Eliade, novelist and renegade mystic, wound up in London in time for the September Blitz. History always entangles human purposes in endless irony. 2 years earlier, Sigmund Freud, fleeing Vienna in the final stages of cancer, found refuge in London. Number 20 Beresfield Gardens, his home until death in 1939, has opened as the Freud Museum. 3. St. James Piccadilly, where William Blake was baptized, has become the church of artists and New Age etceteras, selling quiche, sprouts, and Nicholas Roerich postcards, sponsoring Vivaldi concerts and an occasional Eucharist. This crystalline image of all our doubts and longings, all those false takes, mistakes of grace where men or angels work in ignorance on the way, on the path or on the road to Shambhala or San Francisco, any of those artificial paradises, replacing the home we lost, which Sigmund tells us was the womb. Mircea Eliade found Freudian mythology a symbol for Eden. 4. Wrong steps and false traces, lost on the road to Maresfield Gardens. I ask a passerby who tells me, "Turn left, then left again, then right, and there you are." There you are, like, you can't possibly miss it. It's a British expression which always foreshadows 2 hours of wandering in the labyrinth. Poets like Oscar Miłosz dwelt in precincts of pure inward vision. The rest of us, poor slobs, live in the sprawling suburbs of the mind mired in history. Bare trees here blush with late winter resurrections, weeks before flowers and grass announce their obvious business. Tree roots nurture spring's annual changes. The city arranges itself in confused archaeological layers. Demolition and construction cover the street signs, and first forsythia blooms at the corner of Maresfield Gardens. 5. More or less verbatim from the guide. This room is exactly the way Freud left it, although he would never have had his desk in the same room as the analytic couch. Anna Freud kept these rooms unchanged as a memorial to her father, and would sometimes let in visitors through the double doors which used to be right there, when she held meetings in that side of what used to be a separate room, which, as I say, is exactly as Freud left it. And I said to myself, this must be the place. 6. Memory, distorted, selective, preserves odd essences like some small museum with its giant ground sloth skeleton, or like the Key West mansion more famous for its six-toed cats than for Ernest Hemingway. Pleasure sublimates to obsessive images, and suffering undergoes alchemical transformation. At Covent Garden Station, I found a sign reading Covent Garden, which had come loose, revealing a sign which read Covent Garden, in an identical, if somewhat older, typeface. That's how we put on layers, not like those shelled sea creatures whose growth obeys the law of Fibonacci numbers, but in changes whose new message is typically very much the same as the old one, or, as the 60s rock groups so eloquently put it, here comes the new boss, same as the old boss. 7. Mild air hangs wet over Maresfield Gardens. Wind from the north prophesies spring and a clash of competing weather systems. Seasonal shifts like this misled generations who thought the changes of history were like the doings of men. The mind, stuck in history, still schemes ways of escape. Swiss Cottage Station and its fake Swiss pub are overshadowed by Benihana and a sign for Howard Johnson's. Preoccupied with shifts, breaks, fracture, a change at Charing Cross for Piccadilly, the incompatibility of trains and platforms is shouted with the voice of revelation. Mind the gap! Mind the gap! Mind the gap! Feeling exceedingly literary, I write down the omen. And so we leave our narrator alone in the Eros Hotel with a long, long road ahead, perhaps a different road than the one he expected. He is, I am, at this point, already an art critic, though you can't tell it from the poem. We shall now skip many years of midwinter adventures and leap to the birth of spring 3 years ago. In fact, a poem written exactly 3 years ago today. But there were a couple of side trips in between. Well, sorry, I'm mumbling. You can tell that every time I depart from my script, I screw up. So what I meant was the poem was written was a spring day exactly 3 years ago. We will then move to spring 2 years ago, and 1 year ago with a couple of side trips in between. And then we can all go home, maybe, or at least to bed. But first we find ourselves in Kensington, a district of London, which is at least supposed to show up again in 3 nights' time, in another context altogether in my reading performance in Atlanta. I knew early on that I wanted to write a lifelong poem about life and history and the whole damn thing, kind of the way Ezra Pound wrote the cantos. But I ditched that idea before I turned 30, so it's kind of weird that I seem to have ended up with what amounts to a long poem including history anyway, one that turns my own life into a quest myth, more like, well, a screwed up quest. The only kind we can expect out of life at the end of one millennium and the beginning of another. Kind of the way that Thomas Pynchon took the story of Parsifal blundering around ineptly on the quest for the Holy Grail and turned it into the story of Tyrone Slothrop looking for the truth of his life in the quest for the truth about the V-2 rocket and the zone that comes at the end of a war. There are probably a lot of poem sequences begun in one century and completed in another, but there can't be too many poem sequences that span 2 millennia, even given the huge number of calendars the world has seen since the Babylonians. We're going to come back to the Mayan calendar a little later on. Kind of like the Hindus, the Mayans really went for chronically deep time. All the years from the start of one world age to the start of another one, and another one after that. 1,000-year divisions aren't nearly as impressive, but they happen to be where we are, and the cultures of Europe certainly made a big deal out of a year that wasn't anything special for the Muslim calendar or the traditional Jewish calendar or the Mayan one for that matter. We do happen to be at the end of a whole bunch of different folks' historical cycles, just not the folks we come most in contact with. And I guess that's the kind of thing an inept quester would find amusing. You're at the end of something and the beginning of something else entirely. I'm sure all of us wish we knew just what was ending and beginning. I'll read the poem, which does go on for a while, so bear with me. It's the longest of all the poems by far, so you needn't fear that you're in for a Robert Bly kind of evening. I missed the fabled Robert Bly reading many years ago in which everyone was falling over from exhaustion and announced that he had just been inspired to do yet another epic. This is Seeing Salvation, 6 Shards from a Work Resisting Completion, which is why it goes on forever. Seeing Salvation is the title of a Millennium exhibition at London's National Gallery. As Ezra Pound noted of his would-be terrestrial paradise, the verb is see, not walk on. A line in the canto is followed by his observation, i.e. it coheres all right, even if my notes do not cohere. 1. The wind that blows before and after time, or nowhere around here, mate. 2 epigraphs, one from W.B. Yeats' Sailing to Byzantium, caught in that sensual music, and the correct translation of Sigmund Freud, where it was, there shall I be. The turn of the year 2000 in Britain called for more of a summing up than in less self-conscious places. And so I've come this time to look at the Millennium Dome, the new Jubilee stations, and still more art about history. The future, alas, is here, whether we want it to be or not. I've come again determined to understand better and to tie up loose ends of half a lifetime. Searching for the iconic innocence at the heart of everything, I read naively in college the quartets and cantos of Pound and Eliot, and later perused at length the literature of half the world's sacred traditions. No longer searching like Pound for terrestrial paradise, now I'd settle for finding again the old roof garden I saw for a twilight moment long ago in Kensington on a first quest of exploration at age 22. It was, coincidentally, built across from what had been Pound's digs a couple of consequential decades previously. The years have not been kind to the quest for vision. The dome bodies forth bright dreams of perpetual progress, St. John's 1,000 years of peace turned blissfully secular. Museum shows about the search for happiness or salvation likewise neglect the issue of self-awareness. All neglect monuments of unaging intellect. Thus Billy Yeats. Life is real then only when I am. Thus somebody less literary. And I, perhaps, am not. Perhaps have never been, perhaps will never be. 2. Retracing steps in Maresfield Gardens. Epigraph from Eliade. Difficulty of access to the real point of origin leads to the creation of easy substitutes. Forsythia blooms again on Freud's old street in St. John's Wood, which, just as in 1987, I have trouble finding. At the Freud Museum, a polite Dutch visitor was told, "Yes, this has always been one large room, and the patients would come in here and then go out via what used to be a set of double doors out to the veranda where the bookshop is." "So the patients never would see each other?" Exactly. It is unintelligible, but fundamentally the correct version of what the guide got wrong a dozen years ago. The 100th year of the interpretation of dreams is marked here by a typeset extract recounting a case of dream precognition that is not accounted for by Sigmund's glib explanation. 3. Apocalypse now and then. A visit to the British Museum. Epigraph from the Traveling Wilburys. And it's all right, everything will be okay, and it's all right, every day is Judgment Day. And from the Penguin Books modernization of Julian of Norwich, it is all going to be all right, everything is going to be all right. Apocalypsis, in the Greek original, means that which has been revealed. The exhibition of the Apocalypse at the British Museum is approached by a winding labyrinth of stairs and galleries. The long road to the Apocalypse leads through the past artifacts of Celtic Britain, past the hall of physically encoded mid-Asian wisdom bequeathed to the world by Buddhist missionaries traveling the great roads of desert commerce, and up the steep path beyond Tibet's unforgettable figures of fully realized compassion. 4. Ascension on the Feast of St. Joseph, AD 2000, March 19th. See that one? Epigraph from Peter Handke's script for Wings of Desire. The world behind the world. And from T.S. Eliot's Ash Wednesday. The word within the world. Pret a Manger is a wonderful British chain that gets contextualized very quickly. A star, laconically labeled "Ready" in French, adorns the paper napkins of this Kensington cappuccino shop in the arcade of Marks and Spencer. When I first visited at age 22, it was Derry and Tom's, and the only elevator to the legendary roof garden was in the dark farthest back, so that I found it 5 minutes before closing and caught at most a glimpse of green and statuary before being hustled out past closing doors. When I inquired again in 1989, the Marks and Spencer clerks informed me, "Oh no, sir, there has never been a roof garden in this place. I've heard tell of one around here. Beautiful thing it is, but we don't know how to find it." Excuse me, I thought, if it isn't here, then what are those tree branches peeking over the roof line? I went off, wordless and defeated. Now I'm back, sipping cappuccino at Pret a Manger and contemplating the ascent. I found the elevator at the back a year ago and was told, "Yes, this is the entrance, but I'm afraid it isn't open at the moment." Just last night I was told, "Oh yes, it's open, but I'm afraid there's a private wedding there this evening." I went on last year to Rosslyn Chapel. The lessons of real insight come so seldom. Bruno burned for an arrogant error at the Field of Flowers, and Rasputin ignorantly wrecking the Russian monarchy like the mystic Sabbatians redeeming through sin. Wisdom and compassion, as the Dharma teaches, have too infrequently kissed each other, much less engaged in the kind of carnal union emblematized in Tibetan iconology. It is quite possible, so say the Zen Roshis, to gain enlightenment in the heart of the throbbing city. Pret a Manger is an isolation bubble of noise, offering solace and solitude at a circular table surrounded by jazz and cacophonous talk. The garden exists above, though I haven't yet been there. At length, the three of us leave the arcade for the open air. man alone can accomplish, little is the useful maxim. McDonald's, as I might well have predicted, is across the street from the Paradise Garden. The garden entranceway is round the corner, no longer accessible to merely inquisitive shoppers. As in some well-intended ritual cooked up by the last demented disciple of Sir James Fraser, I round the corner with my two companions and enter an elevator hung with velvet curtains that leads to a gateway where we turn left and are confronted with a tiled court with a statue of Venus and a church spire visible in the middle distance. We gaze enraptured at complex geometry a whole half hour before closing this time. Eventually, having learned from previous embarrassing experience, I look to see what else is there. At the end of a green canopied hall, a second garden combines red tiles and Tudor roses and stone carving. Sunlight filters through vines, vistas open through circular windows that unveil the city. There is more invisible until you round the corner. Ducks and flamingos swim in a watercourse under willows. Spring blossoms profligately around us. In a shady niche, a topiary teddy bear picnic offers an anomalous touch. Retracing our steps to the entrance, we turn to the right, and there, as if choreographed by Carl Jung, a golden carp fixes us with, and I quote, ancient glittering eyes, and the water surface is alive with light as half of modernist British poetry does a grand reprise of images of final revelation and the new life beyond it. And that was it, really. Literature demands illusory resolution, the sense of an ending, dreams of a final theory. Farewell century of Freud and Yeats. In the new world, we can go clear back to Keats and Coleridge and live without irritable reaching after explanation of that which is momentarily explicable. Further along, we'll know all about it, the Southern Gospel hymn assured. Live in the sunshine as in the brief respite of the Kensington roof garden. We'll understand it all by and by, or not, as the case may be. Earlier, as we sat drinking coffee at Pret a Manger, the Morning Guardian reported on death in Uganda, another irritable attempt to force the issue early by a renegade priest longing at last for the end of all things, brought much too tidily to hand. 5. Seeing salvation in Southern or a full moon in March. A misquotation of T.S. Eliot for the epigraph. Who then devised the judgment? Love. Love is the unfamiliar name that wove the intolerable shirt of flame. What color is love? How much does love weigh? Thus the associative questions outside the Museum of Emotions, which turned out not to be open. It is pointless to try to make too much of the walk over the Thames Bridge, where the misty halo around the full moon, like the emblem of Amida, the Buddha of the Western Paradise, half a planet distant. Legend says locally that when there's a ring around the moon, if you do not come too close, if you do not come too close. Ridiculous. No creatures out of folklore or Eliot's East Coker had anything to do with this. Incorrigibly literary at some long-buried core, I looked across at St. Paul's with language borrowed from Ezra Pound's Ravenna. In the gloom, the gold gathers the light against it. When will I learn to see what is actually before me, which is always more unspeakably and genuinely miraculous than any code the imagination idly cobbles together? This is not a cliché. It is a truth unrelated to art. 6. Sailing to Byzantium or flying to Atlanta. From Ezra Pound's cantos, what splendor it all coheres! And from Peter Sheldall's review of the Whitney Biennial, the old distinctions between high and low haven't blurred, they've evaporated. What splendor it all coheres! Even James Bond on the Omnia telescreen looks apocalyptic, taking a tumble on the Millennium Dome, or racing pipeline saboteurs in the ex-Soviet Caucasus, and thereby foiling a scheme to blow up Yeats's beloved city of the mythic monuments of intellect. The 777 offers a routine return. I doze, bewildered, listening to recorded Quran recitation on radio channel 13. As thrice greatest Hermes knew, desire and sleep compose the matrix, and the world is not enough. It coheres all right, even if my notes do not cohere. Thus that old deluded loon Ezra, at a time a decade or two from the end of his life. The unwavering pivot, the holy center at the heart of being, the tree of the knowledge of good and evil by which Siberian shamans climbed to heaven. Sigmund found them all unredeemably phallic. Let us go then, further along, still and still moving for a further union, a deeper communion, remembering the rush of air, bespeaking the tube train's arrival, which Eliot's quartets disguised as metaphysics. As when a tube train pauses too long between stations. However, the train to the Millennium Dome stood when I took it stock still at the station. This is the driver speaking. Owing to an incident at Waterloo, I have been requested to remain at the platform. The incident at Waterloo should be cleared up shortly. A somewhat more famous incident at Waterloo required considerably longer to work through the consequences. The door stayed open. After a long moment of reflection, I headed back the way I came, past the pre-recorded voice of revelation. Please take care when entering a Jubilee train and mind the gap, mind the gap, mind the gap, and all shall be well. One friend in London a few years ago was exceptionally fond of the already forgotten traveling Robaries. And it's all right, everything will work out fine, and it's all right, we're going to the end of the line. Once again I have failed in my ludicrous quest to reach, or at least look at, all the world behind that metaphor. And so I dutifully bore in mind the gap, a reminder repeated on the sweatshirt of a fellow passenger. Sigmund had unkind words for this kind of surplus interpretation. Others, however, found up the royal road to reality. Preoccupied with these impossible dichotomies, I pressed the recline button and reluctantly sleep. One of my earliest teachers, in the special sense I'm using here, was a very little-known guy named Richard Underwood, who just showed up on campus one day because my philosophy professor got to know him at some conference or other and paid him a few bucks to come to Florida in the middle of the winter. What he had to say about myth and philosophy and depth psychology was a whole lot more interesting than anything my professor had to say. It was mostly boring us to death that month, as it was. And what Underwood had to say was that we had within us the resources for our own rescue from our imprisonment. There was a message out of Carl Jung and Joseph Campbell, an idea that was secular but bound to appeal to lost poets at age 19, finding their way out of the grim Calvinist universe of total depravity, irresistible grace, and unconditional election, but unwilling to enter the symbolic universe of anybody else except on psychological terms. It was the season when the world was talking about the death of God, and one in which I read an essay by someone named René Daumal that had been written decades before that suggested basically that maybe it was God who was alive and we were dead, or else asleep. Must we die before we wake up? Ought we to die before we die? But that way of putting it was a long, long way in the future. But I knew Underwood. So here was Dick Underwood proclaiming a gospel I could understand, the only one I could understand at age 19. So I wrote off to get his only published essay from the Hartford Quarterly, Hermes and Hermeneutics, a reading from the perspectives of the death of God and depth psychology. And one of the things Underwood was saying was that Hermes is the messenger of the gods, but he's also a trickster. So he promises his father, Zeus, that he will always tell the truth, because he is the father's messenger. But because he's a trickster, he will not promise to tell all of the truth. Or at most, he will tell different parts of the truth to different people. Now, the Greek name Hermes got attached eventually to the Egyptian god of wisdom and writing, and in that disguise, His name got attached to a bunch of books written by an anonymous Greco-Egyptian Neoplatonist. This is the thrice greatest Hermes to whom I refer in the next poem and whom I just referred to in the previous one. The poem is The Ego in the Body in Northern Georgia. The poem also happens to refer to René de Maul, who turned out to have been involved with a thinker about whom I ended up thinking a great deal more than I ever wanted to, years after I had read de Maul's first essay when I was in college. So, Northern Georgia. The poemandries of Hermes Three Times Great. All are prisoners of love and sleep. From Bob Dylan. And here I sit so patiently, trying to find out what price you have to pay to get out of going through all these things twice. From Hagar the Horrible cartoon. This year I hereby resolve to do all the dumb things I did last year all over again. 1. Prisoners of love and sleep. If one lives long enough and is sufficiently willing to look foolish, every one of one's deepest fantasies will be fulfilled, although never quite in the exact way that one imagined them. Fahey's St. Louis Blues in a room in New Orleans, just as dreamed and desired years before, lonely in California, except that this less than drunken Saturday took place during a convention of the American Academy of Religion. Or Beethoven's Sixth at the end of a long reconciliatory week with another unrequited love, a ridiculous literary device borrowed from an earlier poem, but impossible to have stage managed because the music was playing on FM radio. Life, as Oscar Wilde more or less said, imitates art because in the end art is more interesting in real life. As a result, gets impossibly jealous. Actually, Oscar Wilde didn't quite say that. As Bob Dylan so eloquently put it, I said that. A lifetime of completely comic questing, more or less defined early on by fictional characters. I wanted to be Musillo's Man Without Qualities, but unfortunately my scenarios more typically seem to be written by Thomas Pynchon as outtakes for Gravity's Rainbow, the movie. So here's the critic, as Snoopy would have put it in a Charles Schulz cartoon, being driven to the big art of it by a beautiful woman, climbing stylishly from the BMW, intent on great thoughts and encounters. Of course, the only real part of all this was the BMW and the beautiful woman. Here's the critic, sitting rumpled in the passenger seat, looking silly as usual. The one time I saw a visiting British critic whom I will not name, he was hanging on to the roll bar in some open-topped town version of something that I just lost a page on. You know what? I'm shafted. Okay.
Jerry, I've got the old one.
If you will bring it.
Yeah.
This is really interesting.
Yeah, okay.
We learn, as Buddha did not say from others' depressing examples. Usually, however, all we learn is that this is how you know you fouled up. Love and sleep. I'm not sleep depraved, she remarks, regarding her long night before spent with others. No, in all truth you are not. You are not yet awake, perhaps. Those who know and do not know that they know they are asleep, wake them. Those who do not know and know that they do not know, they are in need, teach them. Those who do not know and do not know that they do not know, they are fools, avoid them. But those who know and know that they know, through them you may attain transformation. Trust them. Slogans of a lost world where wisdom is now supplanted by information and information is drowned in a flood of short-sighted passion. They knew something once in regions now clogged with Al-Qaeda. Stuck behind a car at the crossroads. Come on, move, she says quietly. Move indeed, buddy. Some people's reflexes require a little longer to process sensory information, as in the joke of bashing the mule with a 2x4. First thing you have to do is get their attention. And we're off, and as usual I philosophize at length. 2. clearly stumbles, but the divine mind is abundant. Quote from Ezra Pound's Shadows. 2 epigraphs from the Buddha. Whether Buddhas arise, O priests, or whether Buddhas do not arise, it remains a fact in the fixed and necessary constitution of being that all its contents are delusory. And I don't know whether I can hit the right notes on this, so I won't, because I don't think I can do Sheryl Crow. Sometimes I wonder if all the things I've seen were ever real, or ever really happened. I don't have doubts about your existence, God. Thus the billboard that my ambitious unrequited love interrupts me to point out, saving me from another probably embarrassing revelation which nobody particularly wanted. The problem with most of life is that, as the woman in the New Yorker cartoon put it, I do think your problems are significant, Richard. They're just not very interesting. I, as smart-ass A. Rambeau put it at age 18, is somebody else. The grammatical logic of French dialects preventing the obvious English answer, well, who is you then? Decades after the poet, the pretentious mystic René Guénon wrote in good Hindu fashion, René Guénon does not exist. And young smart-ass René Daumal replied, René Guénon does not exist? Oh, too bad. As he had learned from other remarkable men. And later, he wrote a great metaphysical novel, dying at 36 before he could finish. And You, What Do You Seek? Was to be his final chapter heading. What do we seek? Power, money, sex, the usual. Or for us others, a reliable roadmap out of the world. Frequently desired in combination with power, money, and sex. Dante had it right in that regard about the sequence in which our failings are discarded in purgatory. Oh God, sometimes even artistic success is a failure. The sculpture in Athens of a woman modeled after wax anatomical figures from 18th century Europe. However, here the exposed heart is being nibbled by little birdies, creatures which also explode hungrily from the chest of the twisted male figure, which is also an art history quote. The anatomies of loss and addiction. Yes, the heart feeds on itself, it twitters hopelessly. The only thing wrong with this as art today is a lifetime of bad science fiction movies. Damn, the problem, even with an obvious message, lies always in finding a satisfactory embodiment, as I think T.S. Eliot and Clement Greenberg and all those dead old farts probably said sometime back in the previous century. 3. Athens to Atlanta, or the straight, fast road. Folk proverb. If you fall asleep on the road, you'll lose either your hat or your head. You go in the Velvet Underground. If you choose to lose. The journey, not the destination, was a tired cliche of yesteryear, provoking its pragmatic opposite. If you don't know where you're going, any road will take you there. Baudelaire defined his desired destination anywhere better than this burdensome planet. Athens, Rome, Bethlehem, Berlin, Vienna. Obviously, a lot of the namers of towns in this state really wanted to be living someplace else. Take what you want, but pay for it. My father claims an old Spanish saying regarding one's choices in this world. It is, in theory, possible to combine sainthood, artistic alienation, sexual fulfillment, and worldly success, but the price tag on that one is a little steep, and most of those who scrambled to find the cashier fell off the glassy upper slopes of Mount Analog. You pays your money and you picks your addiction. Drugs or religion or wealth or politics, lust and greed govern the planet no matter which you choose. Though Arjuna, all is clouded by desire, as a fire by smoke, as a mirror by dust. With these it blinds the soul. Not that Krishna had a goddamn thing to say to most of us slobs flopping around in the tower of 1,000 cloudy mirrors. No wonder my contemporaries ended up divided between loonies in this or that gorgeously colored Asian robe, or this or that gorgeously colored running outfit. I'll get you there on time, but the curves are bad and it's going to be a little bumpy. My bright, sensitive driver has no suitably neutral noun to describe her, now that friend, companion, and any other words you care to name, but euphemisms for sleeping partner, which she isn't. I keep quoting her to myself in this misleading fashion because the problem with self-obsessed interior monologues is that they leave very little room for the other person to get an independent word in edgewise. Someday, like the young woman beloved by Mircea Eliade, she will write her own version in which I say almost nothing. What has Athens to do with Jerusalem? Tertullian or some other self-righteous Western saint once said, thus setting forth the terms of the engagement for the next 2 millennia of wars between faith and instrumental reason. The dirty little secret being that when you get right down to it, you might not want to choose either of them. Which side are you on, boys? Choose you this day which you will serve. Labor songs and holy scriptures and graduate students remain in love with binary oppositions, A or not A, 1 or 0. I made my choice and still don't know where this road is going. I can't imagine living in Athens much beyond puberty, my whatever she is observes, and I somehow resist the temptation for a joke about Plato that would get me clobbered. The joke probably would have been something about going from a platonic to a Neoplatonic relationship. I'm not sure. I am sure how the idea of reaching the divine energies through the contemplation of beautiful bodies found its way into Western history via the Sufis. That's another story. Here's this one. Every so often I feel the need to revisit the 25,000-year history of Western art. A few years ago I was en route to Europe on one of my periodic museum crawls when I realized that the earliest known ceramic sculpture, the Venus of Domi Vestelitsa, was coming to me. And the show was opening at Fernbank in Atlanta while I was in Europe. So I emailed long-suffering PR person Marisa Vavoda, who offered to let me meet the curator from the Czech Republic the morning before I left. Wandered into an exhibition that was being set up all around me. Marisa met me, and at length the Czech curator arrived, shambling in with something that looked like a carpenter's toolbox. She sits on the table, opens the lid, reaches in barehanded, pulls out an oval piece of stone, says, "This is the oldest artwork in the exhibition. It is very abstract, and we don't quite know what the spirals and triangles mean. But we think perhaps they represent the female genitalia." Oh, I was still shaking my head and going, "What?" He was pulling out another set of objects, saying, "And this is the oldest puppet in existence. I think perhaps the shaman's doll." The table in front of him was filling up with Ice Age art, and he reaches deep into the toolbox, brings out something wrapped in cloth, and before I know it, thrusting the Venus of Domi Vestelitsa under my nose, and for one terrified moment, I think he's going to drop it into my hands.
Oh, no.
And I'm thinking, oh God, please don't make me the person who dropped the world's oldest ceramic sculpture.
Well, if I get myself right, you